Hello, everyone. Welcome to one of the roundtables, cluster roundtables held by the various clusters at Nickel and Dime at the Center for New Economic Studies, JGU. And in today's roundtable, we have two clusters. One is the international relations and political economy, and the second is the public policy cluster. And we have Sagara, Hemang, Wynnona, and Harsheen from from both the teams with us here today, and myself, Deepanshu. Today, we will basically be discussing the Afghanistan issue from a very international and a public policy aspect. So we will look at various domestic policies that the new Taliban government has proposed. We will also be speculative for a tad bit of this and also look at different aspects of the Afghanistan situation and the international kind of response to the entire crisis and how the various countries have looked at these policies and what they perceive of these policies. Just a general point of disclaimer, all the views that are being put forth are that of the speaker alone and does not represent that of the center or the institution that they are associated with. If you have any more questions or clarifications regarding this, please feel free to reach out to the team and we'll be happy to answer your queries. With that being said, I think we can now begin. And Harsheen and I will be the moderators for today. So Harsheen, why don't you go ahead and ask the first question?
All right. Thank you, Deepanshu, for such a wonderful introduction. So I just want to start at the roots, right? I was wondering, just if you could look at it from a historical perspective, what is the status of USA involvement in the Middle East, but more specifically Afghanistan? So have we seen the US, in the Afghanistan only after, the 9/11 war on terror, or was it before? And where does that stem from? So that's just something I'd like to put across and you guys have the floor.
Feel free to unmute and speak. Yeah, Sagara.
Yeah, if no one else wants to go. I definitely think it was much before 9/11 was even anywhere close to happening. The origins of the US association, or at least their military association with Afghanistan, can primarily be traced back to the Cold War era, when the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan required the US to intervene and basically work with the resistance fighters in the region at the time, which were known as the Mujahideen, and basically fund their resistance against the Soviet Union, because it felt like a matter of national security to the US at the time, that they shouldn't allow the Soviet Union, basically the Iron Curtain, to spread any farther than it already had. So Afghanistan for them was a key area that they had to protect, which is why they felt that the intervention was necessary at the time. And it is what began the very association of the Mujahideen with the US. And it was in fact a key ally to the US, especially because Afghanistan in general is such a difficult territory to navigate. So as a foreign nation, they couldn't have gotten away with actually bringing their own soldiers to fight on that ground without the assistance of local people who had a better idea of how to move across the difficult territory and actually maneuver that territory against the enemy, which at the time was the Soviet Union. Yeah, I think that is the root of where all of this began. And it is the kind of groundwork that they set up in Afghanistan during the Cold War that really led to 9/11 and pretty much all the events since then. So yeah, I think it can be traced back to that war.
Right. No, yeah, that's precisely right. I think I read somewhere that it can be traced back to the Cold War, right? So what happened was it initially started as sort of, I think it was a construction project of some sort, if I'm right. And that sort of funneled into military involvement back in the 1970s. So in the 50s and 60s, it was not much. It was something like China's Button Road Initiative, where they were just like sort of collaborating, say, over these construction projects. But later it turned into that military involvement that you talked about. And like you rightly mentioned, Mujahideen was a very important key player in that whole political scenario. Do you want to talk more about him, because he turns out to be pretty important as we go along this timeline, right? Sagara.
Sorry, what was the last part of your question? I missed it.
I said, do you want to talk more about Mujahideen, because he's a very important player as we go forward? Like, yeah, what does he represent? Where is he from? What are his beliefs? All of that.
Yeah, so the Mujahideen was just like a general term for the Afghani resistance fighters at the time. And they are what grew to become the Taliban as we know them today. And initially it was just these Afghani individuals, and they were the ones who were leading the fight. However, in order to inspire more young men to join the resistance, there was a coordinated effort that was happening in Afghanistan at the time. So this is back in very long ago, like back when the Soviet Union was still in power. There was a coordinated effort specifically by religious leaders in the region to basically preach that this was a holy war, that this was the purpose of Muslims in Afghanistan, to fight against these non-Muslims that had arrived to take their land away from them. So that kind of religious teaching at the time wasn't really given much attention, at least from the US perspective, because they just saw it as a benefit to them, because as long as they could get more players on their side, it didn't really matter how they did it. But that kind of thinking that was instilled at the time definitely carried on to become the kind of thinking or perception of Islam that was then carried forward by the Taliban since then to the present day, right? So the origins of that kind of radical thinking can definitely be traced back to this original war, because they needed more fighters, and religion, they felt, was the most inspirational tool that they could use to get these men to join. And in fact, it was the very reason why they saw a very small group of Arab men from Arab states like Saudi Arabia and so on come to Afghanistan to actually join the war effort. And once again, the US didn't care where these men came from. The origin of these men didn't matter to them as long as they were fighting with the US. And these Arab men were the ones who actually became the Al-Qaeda. And the rest is history. So yeah, that's, I guess, another aspect of that original war.
Sure.
Can I go?
Go ahead. Yeah.
I believe the formation of Taliban in 1994 was more like a desperate act for the preservation of their own identity. After the Soviets left, there were lots of infighting, and there was a question of there was this back at that time there was this question of what we can say that what really Afghans were. So it was more the preachings were more about preservation of old identity in the whole nation, and that idea, that desperation for the preservation of their own identity led to the reproduction of the very restrictive or very oppressive rules of Sharia imposed in Afghanistan.
All right. Yeah. Thanks. That's a very important insight. I just like the timeline a bit forward, since we don't have all the time in the world, and focus on what happens after, Bush sends the troops in. What happens after that? So if anyone has any points, feel free to go ahead, or else I'll just try to summarize it.
The Bush administration's actions, I think, in the perspective of how they helped the Taliban, I would say that they gave them training that they did not previously have. Even during the Cold War, they had gotten a lot of military equipment, but there wasn't as much like an active effort to train these individuals as there was during the era of the Bush administration. So that was something that was different, I think, if anybody else has some other points.
Sure. Try it. No, makes sense because so this is my story and what I've gotten so far from my readings is that the Bush administration sent the troops in and you know the troops stayed there, but then their sort of goal of what their goal is to weed out terrorism or transnational organizations of crime, that goal sort of faded away, or that they just started losing clarity. And in the Afghanistan papers, which is a very popular, I think they were released a year ago by the Washington Post, and they caused a massive outbreak, like in public. It was a big thing in the media, and that talked about um, how these there were soldiers and war generals from the US Army, like super confidential sources, in interviews where they had accepted that we did go there, but once the objective became nation building and then building an army, we just really forgot what the point was. We didn't know what winning or victory looked like. So one soldier just asked, what does victory look like if we are to come out of Afghanistan at some point? And really, their commander in chief didn't know that, and that's where know that the US sort of started losing focus, and that spread over to other sort of US presidencies. Just kind of fast forward through it, from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden. Of course, we see all the different four presidents dealing it in their own unique ways. For example, Obama, I think Obama was the one who sent the most troops in. I saw the graph. The number of troops in the US was very low, and then at Obama it reached its peak. Then as Trump came along, it lowered. Biden completely sort of evacuated the whole thing. So yeah, that is sort of the trajectory of US involvement.
Yeah, and to I think add on to the conversation, I just also wanted to say that we'll also have to contextualize to Harsheen's last point, that there has been a graph of the number of US troops in Afghanistan. And I think for that we'll also have to contextualize the numbers with the time. So essentially, if you see that during Obama, the numbers rose. So a possible explanation for that could be the 2011. It was 2011, if I recollect correctly, when the US carried out an operation on Osama. So was it then to kind of maintain that stability in Afghanistan when they are carrying out such a large scale operation in Abbottabad? And then, obviously the pandemic hit now, and Trump is known to be somewhat of a protectionist. So then again, putting US interests first. So that led to kind of this starting of this withdrawal. And then, yeah, like Biden had to come. So I now wanted to kind of shift gears onto the domestic situation in Afghanistan, and kind of ask that the Taliban recently conducted a press conference where it also addressed certain concerns that the international community had held. So what do you all think are the Taliban's key domestic concerns or focus areas, and how different do you think they will be from a democratic government, primarily the one which the US kind of set up in the past 20 years?
Can I go first? I believe there's an interplay between Taliban's domestic concerns with their international stance. I think first of all, they would try to prevent any kind of inside resistance. I mean, there's still fighting going on Panjshir. They would try to win it or subside it as soon as possible, because in the world, if they could present a united front, that would help them gain access to foreign aid, which has stopped drastically and has crumbled the Afghan economy.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And you raise a very interesting point about the Afghan economy. And that's something we also come back to, I think, a couple of questions later. So maybe then we can draw your insights into that. So I think, Wynnona, would you want to kind of take ahead?
I was actually thinking about the second part of your question. And I believe the Taliban's actually come out and proclaimed that they are not going to form a democracy, that that's not something they are looking towards setting up. And that's raised a lot of questions about what that means for how the Taliban government is going to be structured and who's going to be in it, because the interim government is largely loyalists, male from a particular ethnic background. And so we've been seeing a lot of uprisings in like specific pockets of Afghanistan. And how does the government sort of represent various Afghanistan interests then, right? If they're not willing to establish a democracy, how do they prevent it from turning into a dictatorship? And is that something they want, or is that largely just like an international relations stance they're taking? Also, I think they're going to have to look at terrorism, especially in terms of their international partners, right? From Iran and China and Russia, they're all waiting to see what their stance is going to be there and how they're going to curb terrorist activities before they're completely willing to form alliances or like properly, yeah.
At this point, I think I think that their opinion on terrorism would be quite would be quite friendly with other nations, because right now Taliban is in dire need for foreign aid, and not just because of the crumbling economy or people starving there. Taliban, I mean, it's for sure that worldwide, not all nations are gonna recognize Taliban as a legitimate government immediately. Some would still oppose it. So the foreign aid would come in handy for strengthening their own military. So keeping that in mind, Taliban would prefer to form their opinions on terrorism, which would go in hand with other nations.
Sagara, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, most of my points have been covered. I don't really expect them to form a democratic government anytime soon, specifically because they made it clear in their very first press conference, if I remember correctly, that they will build a government that is both inclusive and Islamic, like their quote. But again, it's their interpretation of Islam and their interpretation of inclusivity, which is very much not inclusive. So there have already been a lot of cases of violence against the Hazara community in Afghanistan and several other ethnic minorities. And they have claimed to make sure that women will be continued to be able to access all of the things that they have been able to access in the past within the framework of Sharia law, which once again, it is their extreme interpretation. So how far that will go in terms of helping them build a pseudo-democratic government, I don't know. I really doubt it. But yeah, it remains to be seen, because as Hemang mentioned, they're going to have to do a lot more than just empty promises to convince other nations to give them aid, because their economy is at such a state that they can't simply survive on their own. They are in desperate need of foreign aid. And because states are so afraid of being accused of funding terrorism, they're not going to be able to give that aid to the Taliban unless they can give some kind of solid assurance through their kind of democratic or close to democratic governance to show that, oh, we actually have a legitimate government here that you can support and you can give funds to.
Yeah, I agree. And just wanted to add on a little bit, and maybe then Harsheen can take us to the next question. Is that I felt there was also especially Western media there was a perception of some kind of whitewashing that was done in the press conference, basically trying to paint the picture that, oh, Afghanistan is stable now in the hands of Taliban. And, like I think Sagar also mentioned that they were very explicit in saying that it will be an Islamic government. But at the same time, they said things like they are going to allow free media as long as it works within the Islamic laws. So I'm not saying that Islam is opposed to free media. I'm just trying to point out the way they shaped that statement. And also their relationship with Al-Qaeda was masked very well, and they were reassured, the world was reassured that, okay, there are no longer going to be any terrorist attacks stemming from Afghanistan. Whereas, well, we know a few days later, they had that independence parade wherein they showed so many different improvised vehicles and explosive devices and suicide bombers and whatnot. So yeah, I think that was one thing that I wanted to point out.
Yeah, one last point.
Hi,
It's also
can you
just,
hear me?
sorry, one last point. Also just
All
like
right.
on a very logistical level, like, are they going to hold like multi-party elections? Are they going to actually support an electoral process that elects what Taliban leaders come into, like, are Taliban leaders going to stand for election? Like, how do they plan on going, like, if they were to build a democratic government, how would they build it? But I really doubt that they have any plans to do any of those things. So a democratic government is definitely not in question. It's just some form of an authoritarian government with members of the Taliban. Perhaps not a dictatorship, because they don't seem to have one such leading figure as such who seems to want all the power. It just seems to be like their Taliban as a group holding power, their senior leadership. That's the kind of government that we can expect in the future.
Right. Wow, so much to say here. Am I audible, guys? Is my voice all right? Because it was a problem a while back. Okay, great. So, no, so much to say about the whitewashing point, because I'm not exactly sure if whitewashing is the right way to say it. I would call it more media friendly, I guess, because the ideas of inclusivity and, the way they want to make it more like, I guess, increase their press value or something, right? The way they're selling themselves. If that's a rudimentary term that's right to be used at. So that makes me think a lot about Taliban 2.0, and we've seen this surface up a lot. And this is the next topic of discussion for me. And that is that there was a Taliban back in 1996 to 2001, and there's one now. And there are, some people are saying that there is a new Taliban because of their claims, because of what the spokesperson said in their first international conference, first press conference, and things like that. So, but of course, we've not really seen anything in action. We have seen words from them, but this may be construed as a big thing, considering the words weren't really there in the first place. Like 20 years ago, we didn't get these words of reassurance that, hey, it will be inclusive, hey, Afghani girls will go to school, or that they'll do everything, that is, that they deserve, they deserve to get an education and all of that. And they weren't saying that many years ago, so a lot has changed. So that's my question to you guys. Do you think it hasn't? Any takers?
Personally, yeah, I definitely think there's been a lot of change in terms of not only how they present themselves to the world, but also how they control the region. One very obvious difference has been the fact that they are a lot more militarily equipped this time around. Now that there's all of the leftover equipment because of the US forces evacuating, they have a lot more military prowess, which in turn gives them a diplomatic edge that they didn't have before, because you're dealing with the Taliban that is not only controlling most of the country, but also controlling it with weapons and with arms. So that's a whole new Taliban that you're dealing with in the first place. And secondly, this time around, there seem to be a lot more, like you mentioned, they're a lot more aware of how they present themselves to the world, because they're actively engaging in PR. Because before, they would have never felt the need to clarify that, oh, we are still protecting women, we are still protecting minorities. That's not something that would never cross their mind when they take over a nation. But now they're very clear about making those statements, at least on the surface level, even if they may not be actually carrying out the actions to support it. They definitely are concerned about making it clear to not only people within their own nation, but worldwide because they know the world is watching, and they're using that platform to say that, hey, we are the progressive Taliban, we are going to whatever version, whatever that means, that we are going to protect women within our own framework, within our own understanding of Islam. We will make sure that women still have access to all of the amenities that they would get, that they would have had in the past.
I want to add a point to that. The reason for this new Taliban could be that right now, I mean, in its previous rule, Taliban was more isolated on the world level. It had no supporters, but right now it has support from it has explicit support from China and Pakistan, which might be implicitly forcing it to behave in the way it is behaving right now.
Should we take a pause?
I think Wynnona can comment on this if she'd like.
Actually, I was going to add on to Sagara's point about how they're presenting this facade, I guess, and they're also largely doing it in terms of how they're structuring their government, how they are talking about interacting with the previous Afghanistan president, how a lot of their interim government are members who have defected from the previous Afghanistan government, right? But obviously weaker members. And again, all the claims about human rights, but I don't necessarily know if that's what we're seeing on the ground, if that's what they're actually doing versus if that's just what they're saying.
Right. May I just use this moment to segue into something that I read about, and that is what the people in Afghanistan and the people in Kabul specifically, the millions of people who live there, because it's very densely populated, the millions of people who live there, what do they think about the Taliban seizure of power, right? And I saw in Al Jazeera interviews, a couple of them, that people were not disappointed, surprisingly, or at least I'm not sure if this is for the wide range of people, but the people who were interviewed, they were not disappointed. Why? Because the Taliban seizure of power was, well, it was quick and all of that, but it was rather bloodless when you look at the civilian front, right? It was very smooth and civilians weren't necessarily like, they didn't have to be harmed. And I think this all just adds up to our point about good PR. And also adding on to what Hemang said about the support that the Taliban is explicitly getting from 3 of its neighboring nations right now. I think this Taliban has a plan in a way that the previous Taliban didn't have. And this Taliban plans to stay. And so it has some people on its side, those people being some from Kabul, and then the external supporters as well. So this would be my conclusion. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And just borrowing from Hemang, who really, put us, kind of propelled us to our next question, was what does the possible alliance of Taliban, Pakistan, and China mean for India? And is it primarily a cause for concern? Because we know that Pakistan does have some kind of alliances with Taliban, and China, although hasn't formally recognized Taliban yet, but there's a high likelihood of it doing so. And we know that Chinese politics has been kind of agnostic about Taliban's presence in Afghanistan, also in the Cold War era, when they invited the Talibani delegation to China just to kind of address, the problems they had with them, and the entire world thought that, oh my God, they're going to recognize Taliban. So we can never be too sure about that. But if we could kind of, given the context today, entertain a possibility of that kind of alliance, or if alliance is too strong a word, relationship between the 3 kind of parties, what would that look like? And would that be a concern for India? Feel free to pitch in.
This possible alliance would force India to take precautionary measures, because first I need to give some context about the POK or Pakistan controlled Kashmir. I mean, that area was already that area was already under Pakistan's control, but after the construction of economic corridor between Pakistan and China through that region, that particular area is sort of fortified, and it's sort of impenetrable for India. So given this possible alliance, India has to be on its guard for coming years, because the possible movement of arms as well as people through that corridor, it would be difficult for India to keep a check on that, and the only thing India could do is wait for them to act and then react.
Anyone else would like to comment? Yeah, Sagara.
Yeah. While it makes sense to wait for them to make the first move, because as of now, India doesn't have any incentive to continue its engagement with Afghanistan, considering everything. But there is also the fear that that might be too late, because at least from the terrorism perspective, like both Pakistan and like both Islamabad and Beijing have put pressure on the current Afghan government to prevent any kind of terrorist groups from taking actions against Pakistan or China, as in Pakistani officials or Chinese officials that are engaged with Afghanistan. So, and the Afghan government so far has, I believe, promised to do that. They have made no such promises towards India, which again further gives us more reasons to keep our distance from Afghanistan currently. But that's not guaranteeing any promises that there won't be any terrorist attacks, either on, maybe not on Afghani soil, but maybe on Indian soil or somewhere else where these groups have influence. So there is a fear that if we hold away from engaging with Afghanistan too long, it might lead to something worse. But as of now, there's definitely very few incentives to engage with the Taliban government. Yeah.
There's another point that I would like to add to this. This possible alliance between the three nations could also raise concerns for India, because both of the nations could initiate proxy wars in India, and they won't be directly responsible for it. So last two times there was the Pakistan tried to infiltrate India. India retaliated with airstrikes and surgical strikes. So the use of the possible use of such proxy wars would tie India's hands to react to these situations, and in that case, we would only suffer and won't be able to retaliate.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think Wynnona had something to add, then I'll add something. Yeah.
I was saying, yeah, India is worried from like a terrorism militancy point of view. I remember about the Taliban told the Indian government that any diplomats in Kabul would be guaranteed safety if they remained in Kabul. But the Indian government also had intelligence that Pakistani militants were in the country, and so they pulled out the diplomats. So this relationship is definitely something they're worried about, but they're also worried about the economic angle, right? Where China is currently building the Belt Road Initiative, and Pakistan is part of that, and then there's talks of Afghanistan being part of that, and that kind of isolates India in its own backyard, right? Yeah.
Right, and I think 2 points that just came to my mind, while discussing this was also this anxiety that India kind of has now with regards to this triad right in its backyard was also kind of explicitly visible, in the recent summit that our Prime Minister attended. And like his statement saying that India needs to be careful with radicalization. In my reading of it, it was a very direct, mention. And I think if I remember correctly, he also directly mentioned Afghanistan and that the world has to be warned about that situation. So it's I don't think that India is trying to hide its anxiety, but at the same time, I do feel that we really need to take each and every step very carefully while kind of approaching this. So and I think another anxiety that India might have is if Taliban forms a government, proper government in Afghanistan, they'll also have a say in multilateral fora like the UN, because all countries must have an equal representation in the GA. And that's where I think it also kind of becomes a quote unquote problem. And we've seen that in the past as well, when, I think the Western powers recognized the coup governments in Cambodia and those areas. So there was a lot of diplomatic tussle in the region that happened during those times. And I wouldn't be surprised if those kind of things are revisited now with a much more nuance depending on the context for sure. But yeah, and yeah.
So most of the anxieties that we are discussing right now, I think they're very valid. But the point about multilateralism and considering the UN to be the mecca of multilateralism, I just like to point out what my professor said. Actually, he is Professor Mohan Kumar. He was retired as the ambassador to France recently, and he's now a professor in good standing at Jindal. And I was really taken by what he said, and he pointed out to us in our UN system course that the UN needs 2/3 majority vote by the general, sort of the General Assembly, the UNGA, to call, a Taliban-led Afghanistan, sort of like I guess, for it to gain legitimacy in a way, right? So talking about that legitimacy, I don't think it's going to come very soon, considering how much 50% of the world is democratic right now. I don't know if I've looked up Freedom House's latest index, but some aspect, but yeah, a major chunk of the world is democratic, and we don't see that legitimacy being gained by the Taliban anytime soon, no matter how much regional influence it gains. So yeah, although I must add on that I'm not sure about the 50% democratic aspect because the index keeps shifting. So I'll let you know by the end of this call. But yeah, so up next, since we are talking about anxieties, right, that leads to one big anxiety, and that is of human rights. So I was just wondering, what is the stance that Taliban will likely take when it comes to, terrorist organizations and human rights concerns? And this will take us to the discussion of Taliban 2.0 back again. So feel free to go there.
Yeah, I think we've already talked largely about Taliban's international standing and stance related to human rights, how they claim they're going to protect women's freedoms, and there's not going to be any action taken against former government officials or those that supported the former government. But something that I saw brought up a lot was the fact that district and provincial officials within the Taliban also implement policies according to their own translations of these policies, right? So, for example, whether or not girls go to school depends on that official's own views, his standing within the hierarchy of the Taliban, and then his relationship with the community. So that differs from province to province, and it's not necessarily possible for Taliban to claim a stance and then for you to expect to see that on the ground. For example, they talked about how as long as journalists stick to Islamic standards, journalism will be allowed, but largely televisions in some districts are prohibited, or smartphones are restricted and prohibited. So what does that mean at that level, right?
I agree with Wynnona's point here, and I believe that Taliban would be juggling with human rights, would be juggling with the typical notions of human rights. So they might allow women they would allow girls to attend schools, but it won't be a co-ed education. They would allow women to participate in they would allow women to work, but they might not be allowed to work in private sector. They would only be allowed to work in essential public sectors like healthcare or education. In that way, and the thing with media is with Taliban controlling media in the nation, they would be signifying they would be signifying the different steps they are taking from their earlier regime to make it look like that they are concerned for the human rights of Afghans.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to something that Hemang mentioned. So yeah, I saw a recent BBC report about a university in Afghanistan that had reopened after the coup took place. And there was a clear separation even within a classroom between the women and the men. There was a curtain drawn across the class where the women were seated on one side and they could not look or interact with the male members of the classroom and vice versa. So that is the most progressive version that we can really expect in terms of women's access to education in the Taliban. And who's to say that it won't get any more conservative in the future, right? And as Wynnona mentioned, they don't really have a strict code book as such in terms of how they interpret Sharia law across the nation. It's all up to the individual decisions of whoever the Taliban leader is in a certain province, right? So, which is why in IR, we have these discussions of the interpretations of what human rights is like differs from the West to the East. So it's not necessary that the Taliban would see any of the things that they do as a violation of human rights, because as far as they see somebody who has robbed someone, perhaps stolen a goat or stolen livestock, they might see that as warranting having their hand cut off because they committed a sin that warranted that kind of action. And they don't see that as a violation of human rights. They see that as a just punishment for the crime that had been committed. So, well, will there be human rights violations, at least from the Western perspective? Definitely. It has already begun against every form of minority, gay people in Afghanistan, women in Afghanistan, minorities in Afghanistan, they're all under threat. But whether that will be considered a violation, at least under the Taliban government, I don't think so, because that is not their interpretation of human rights. For them, if you are doing something according to their very conservative and radical interpretation of Sharia law, that is not violating any rights whatsoever. And even when Western nations claim to be concerned about the human rights violations in Afghanistan, it's definitely it's a veiled concern, because their real concern is, will we have to deal with Afghanis refugees coming to our shores, especially nations like Germany and the US and the UK? That's their real concern. It's not whether these people are getting hurt by the Taliban government, while that might be what they're telling the rest of the world. The real concern is, will they be fleeing their nation and coming to our shores? Will we have a Syrian refugee crisis 2.0? And if that is the real concern, and if Taliban is going to make these very surface level claims saying that, no, we are continuing to give them access, no, we are continuing to ensure that there is due process in every crime that we deal with. If they can make those surface level claims, and if the nations that support them, like Pakistan and China, find those claims to be legitimate, then that means that these Western governments don't have to worry about these refugees coming to their nations, because they can no longer be considered refugees if they belong to a nation where the government is apparently legitimate and stable. So if the Taliban government gets some kind of recognition, that is another issue that they would have to deal with, which is that people who are genuinely fearing for their lives will not really be able to seek asylum in another country, because they are recognized as belonging to a nation that is stable.
All right. Some very based points are made by all of you here. So I just like to take this moment to conclude, because there's a lot to ingest here. There's a lot to sort of break down, right? So yeah, I just want to talk about what we discussed today. We started with the historical background of Hemang, could you switch off your mic? Could you like mute yourself? Great, thank you. So yeah, we started with the historical background and just like outlined, a US and Taliban's relationship, starting from, the 1950s up to here, current day. And just did that very briefly, after which we moved on to the concerns of the international community, right? And what were some of the focus areas of Taliban and how we think it'll be different from a democratic government. After which we moved on to Taliban 2.0, where we had a really interesting discussion about like the PR aspects and how it is, quote unquote, whitewashed, or a different version of Taliban that is being put up. Going forward, we also discussed something very, very essential, which was what the Taliban rule means for India. That was very well covered by Hemang, right? And to that, we discussed that the anxieties in India, they're very explicit. The tension, it is very obvious. It is by no means it is hidden, right? And it's a very obvious concern. It's a very big geopolitical threat because of the trifecta that we see, right? So that is a major concern for us. And lastly, we now wrapped up with the human rights, sort of the human rights considerations, to which Sagara very wonderfully concluded by saying that if we take sort of the typical Amnesty International definition of human rights, they are not going to be, granted in Afghanistan. To which I say, let's not like have that anthropological, let's not do that anthropological mistake, as long as sort of the civilians of Afghanistan are safe and all right, which they're not, and there are breaches of security, but there are breaches of safety and dignity and all of that. But yeah, let us try to use a more reasonable yardstick would be my suggestion when we're looking at a crisis like this one unfold. So I think those would be our ending remarks, which brings us to the end of our discussion here. So thank you everyone who tuned in and everyone who watched till the end. The five of us talking about things that are important to us. And yeah, with that we conclude. Thank you.